Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Lucy Tassell.
The government has released its first assessment of the risks posed by climate change across Australia. The report paints a concerning picture with predictions about what the future could look like if rising temperatures are not curbed, including a 450% increase in heat-related deaths in some parts of the country. Overall, the risk assessment warns that no Australian community will be immune, but the government says it has a plan. Today, we are breaking down what this assessment found, what these findings mean for Australia's future, and how experts say we need to move forward in what is shaping up to be a very big climate week for the government, with its 2035 emissions reduction target expected by Friday.
So, Emma, this is the first time we've received a report like this. For those listening who might not understand, perhaps for your co-host in the studio who might not know, what is this National Climate Risk Assessment?
Yes, so this is a publication, a report from the Australian Climate Service. Now, that is a government partnership of multi-agencies, including the Bureau of Meteorology, the CSIRO, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and Geoscience Australia. So those expert groups have come together to assess how climate change will impact 8 key systems across our society. So this includes our communities, defence, the economy, health, infrastructure, the national environment, primary industries, and First Nations groups. So the risk assessment, as you mentioned, Lucy, is the first time we've had something like this, a nationally consistent, evidence-based evaluation of climate risks across all these different areas. So basically, it's the most comprehensive analysis of climate risks to date. But what is interesting about it is that it looks at climate impacts really broadly in terms of how they will affect not just the environment, but health systems, infrastructure, the economy, all of those systems at once.
So what are the key findings that we should know about?
So I do have to warn you that most of the findings are pretty dark. It is a pretty grim assessment.
Yeah.
So I want that to be what we're holding on to going in, but also knowing that there is a plan, a strategy, and a framework we're going to get to.
Okay.
But the risk assessment models outcomes under 3 warming scenarios to assess what will happen at different stages. So there's kind of a forecast of how bad will things be at 1.5 degrees of warming, 2 degrees, and 3 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. Now, based on current global projections, the world is on track to see 2.9 degrees of warming this century. So the worst case scenario in this report is not that far out of the realm of possibility.
And that's a lot more than what we've talked about on this podcast before in terms of the Paris Agreement seeking to limit emissions to reduce warming to less than 1.5 degrees above industrial levels. So 2.9 is almost double that.
Exactly. And Australia has already reached 1.5 degrees.
Yeah.
The headline finding is that climate risks to Australia are escalating rapidly and will worsen significantly by 2050 without action.
Okay.
What is particularly concerning is that these risks don't exist in isolation. They, quote, compound and cascade across different systems. So an example of this is a major flood, right? Doesn't just damage housing and infrastructure.
Yeah.
It disrupts supply chains, affects mental health, it impacts agriculture, it can overwhelm emergency services, it can cost the government in disaster relief funding, there are insurance implications. So this assessment is really looking at that bigger picture, and it found that many of Australia's climate hazards will become more intense and occur in areas that haven't experienced them before.
I see.
So we're looking at more frequent heat waves, bushfires, flooding, coastal hazards from rising sea levels.
Yeah.
More intensely, in more places, more frequently.
What are some of the places that are most at risk?
So the assessment identifies several key areas of particular concern. The first is Northern Australia. So this includes the Northern Territory and parts of Queensland and WA. We know these regions are exposed to multiple climate hazards, including heat waves, flooding, tropical cyclones, bushfires, often simultaneously.
Yes.
So the forecast is that that gets worse in that part of the country. Coastal communities right across Australia as well, though, face heightened risks from rising sea levels, according to the risk assessment. So it found that by 2050, the number of coastal communities in high and very high risk areas will more than double from 8 to 18%.
Right.
And if current populations remained the same, this would mean 1.5 million people living in areas experiencing rising sea levels and coastal flooding risks by 2050.
And I mean, when you say coastal communities, I think of population maps I've seen of Australia, which shows that pretty much everywhere in Australia is a coastal community, even if it might not feel like it if you're in, for example, where I am, further into the west. I'm not like on the sea, but I'm still in what could be classified as a coastal community.
You live in a major city on the eastern seaboard.
Yeah, exactly.
As you've mentioned, most Australians do live in quote-unquote coastal communities.
Yeah.
Remote communities as well, though, according to this report, are particularly vulnerable. They often depend on single supply chains.
Right.
So there's limited infrastructure and access issues. When something goes wrong, these communities have fewer alternatives, and that also is set to worsen with worsening climate outcomes.
Yeah. We've touched a little bit on the cities, the places where most Australians tend to live, but what more can you tell me about the projected impacts on the cities?
Yeah, so specifically in outer urban areas of cities, the report notes that these places are watch points because they're particularly susceptible to adverse impacts due to their location, demographics, and exposure to hazards. Coastal cities, as we've touched on, face significant challenges from rising sea levels, and urban centres are increasingly at risk from extreme heat events, which the risk assessment noted strain energy systems and impact public health services. The assessment projects heatwave deaths will increase really significantly. This is a major headline out of this report.
Yeah.
For example, in Sydney and Darwin, current warming scenarios could lead to a predicted 400% surge in heatwave deaths.
Wow.
Even under the lower 1.5 degrees of warming scenario, where we are at, heatwave mortality would still double.
Yeah.
Health broadly is one of the systems facing the most severe risk escalation.
Yeah.
So current health risks are listed as moderate to high, but they are expected to reach severe levels by 2050. Interestingly, diseases like dengue fever, Japanese encephalitis, these are also likely to spread as temperatures and rainfall patterns change. So the report notes that healthcare systems are less experienced in managing these kinds of diseases. And then there's a whole other conversation about preparedness.
So one of the things that could change for Australia if more and more people are getting sick in different and new ways is that the economy can be affected, because if people aren't able to work, or it's very difficult to do certain jobs because of the weather, that has like long-term flow-on effects.
Exactly.
What else did it say about the economy?
Hi, I'm Ola.
And I'm Elliot.
We're the two-person team behind everything video and audio here at the Daily Aus.
If you want to help us grow so we can deliver more of the content that you love, be sure to hit subscribe.
Now let's get back to the video.
So the report discussed insurance losses from natural disasters. We know that these have surged in recent years.
Yeah.
But they're predicted to continue increasing. With that comes increased premiums, communities getting priced out of insurance policies. And as a result, government emergency disaster spending will also surge to support impacted communities. Looking ahead, projected disaster costs across all states and territories could total more than $40 billion per year by 2050. That's under the most moderate emissions scenario. So that is a figure that includes both financial and social costs.
Yeah.
And this stood out to me as really interesting. The report estimates that Australian property values could face losses of more than $600 billion by 2050.
Wow.
So that's the kind of housing impact of the cost of coastal erosion, flooding, rising sea levels. You don't often hear the property market discussed in such grand losses. We usually are talking in the complete reverse terms. The report also noted that increased and more intense heat waves will strain energy systems at the exact time when people are going to need them the most.
Yeah.
And, this could see power prices surge even further.
We've now touched on people quite a bit. What about our natural environment? How are our ecosystems expected to cope with all of these changes?
Yeah, this is honestly one of the most concerning areas. The natural environment, as we already know, as we've discussed at length here before, faces really high risk from climate change, and this is expected to escalate to severe levels by 2050. So by that point, between 40 and 70% of native plant species will be exposed to climatic conditions that they don't currently experience. So then those plants will be facing potential extinction events.
Yeah.
Our coral reefs face an almost certain risk of catastrophic consequences. Even at current levels of warming, ocean pH is projected to change significantly, making it so much harder for corals and shell-making organisms to survive.
Yeah.
And the report warns of potential ecosystem collapse in many, many years with this sort of cascading effect on the services these ecosystems provide. So clean water, coastal protection, carbon storage. I could go on.
Yeah. Just from my quick look at the report, I know it also examines risks to First Nations communities specifically. What can you tell me about that?
So the risk assessment identified 7 nationally significant climate risks specifically affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. These include physical impacts, as well as threats to connection to country, threats to connection to cultural practices, which can have significant social and emotional impacts. As well, for Torres Strait Islander communities, the assessment looked at rising sea levels, which pose direct threats to homes and cultural sites. So, the ongoing theme of this assessment is what looks like maybe one risk is, really representative of an entire suite of threats.
Yeah. So governments don't tend to release documents this bleak without also having some kind of accompanying action. What has the government said they're going to do about all of this?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Alongside this risk assessment, we have a national adaptation plan. This is basically looking at, okay, how can we adapt policies to move or grow with climate change, to get ahead of climate change? So, it's not all bleak. There are some kind of scaling up of climate change approaches, emissions reductions efforts that would mitigate a lot of these risks, or at least reduce them, or improve our resilience, lessening the impact of climate disaster. So this policy framework notes some initiatives that are already underway. This includes Australia's first National Health and Climate Strategy and something called the Torres Strait and Northern Peninsula Area Climate Resilience Centre, which is being established to support communities facing immediate climate impacts. Exactly how the government will respond to this risk assessment remains to be seen. This plan kind of emphasises that climate response is a dynamic and moving, kind of living, breathing thing. It's not a static one fix, one page solution. The government's really talking about bigger picture ideas, working with states, territories and local governments to create an action agenda for this plan, which it's promising by the end of next year. So, it might sound depressing, but it is just the beginning, really. This is a stepping stone. We have this risk assessment, and now we need to continue monitoring and updating how we understand conditions changing. And as we learn more about climate and its impacts and how they unfold, policymakers will respond appropriately, according to what this plan says.
How have those policymakers responded so far?
So Minister for Climate Change and Energy Chris Bowen called the risk assessment and adaptation plan a, quote, roadmap to address the unavoidable impacts of climate change to build a more resilient country for all communities, regions and industries. Greens leader Senator Larissa Waters said, quote, the revelations about Australia's future under climate change detailed in this report are chilling. The Climate Council, which is an independent not-for-profit, the Greens and independent Zali Steggall have all separately responded to the findings, criticising the government's approvals of recent coal, oil and gas projects, which they separately say are holding Australia back from emissions reduction targets.
Yeah.
And Waters said, quote, this report must be a wake-up call for Labor ahead of their 2035 climate target decision.
Which is due this week, right?
Exactly. So really quick refresher. Countries signed up to the Paris Agreement, that includes Australia, are set to announce their emissions targets for 2035 ahead of this year's COP30 climate conference in Brazil. So Australia, as part of that group, is actually expected to announce its target later this week. Thursday or Friday are the days that we are hearing rumoured for the big announcement. The government so far hasn't made any firm commitments to put the target into law. It's been awaiting analysis for a 65 to 75% emissions reduction target target from the Climate Change Authority to inform its decision. Now, the Climate Council separately is urging the government to legislate the strongest possible 2035 climate target, and it called the risk assessment this week a horror story.
Yeah.
But Lucy, this is not the last you are going to hear about all of this over the coming days. I can promise you that. So brace yourself for several other reports, including on net zero. There's a report coming on how to reduce pollution across the economy and, critically, the 2035 target alongside the Climate Change Authority's advice.
Thanks so much for explaining all of that to us, Emma.
Thank you for having me. Strap in. It's going to be a big one.
It's going to be a big one, and we will be keeping all of you updated over on the TDA feed and probably back in this podcast feed again. We'll be back this afternoon with the headlines. Until then, have a great day.